And yeah, I'll just say again, thank you for having me tonight and for sharing with me, um, allowing me to share with all of you. So I mentioned before the sit that I've been teaching at Insight Santa Cruz for the past 10 years or so. I moved to Santa Cruz from the Northwest to start my PhD, actually, in environmental sociology. And John mentioned that I have some interest in nature connection, and that's very true. So my work is related to environmental justice, particularly water justice. And I've been also engaged in um, creating and teaching a Buddhist eco-chaplaincy training program with Gil Fronsdell and Susie Harrington. We're just beginning our second cohort. It's a year-long training. So it's a little bit about me. When I was invited to give a talk tonight, I actually thought that what I would share about would be around the Brahma Viharas, and that was primarily inspired because that's the weekly offering that I make at Insight Santa Cruz. And for those who aren't familiar, the Brahma Vihara, it translates as the abodes of the heart, or the four immeasurables. And I'll get into some more detail about that in a minute, but just to say that it's been really beautiful for me to explore more intimately both the traditional and contemporary and extemporaneous teachings and practices that have emerged around the heart practices, and to be offering those in community every week. So I was starting to formulate a talk around that, and I was making some notes about some of the insights that have come for me in that practice and in offering it. And I found myself actually contemplating wise response. It's kind of where my thinking started to lead me tonight. Really the question of what it is to sit with suffering, and the courage and open-heartedness that are required to respond wisely to suffering in the world. And these are themes that we really emphasize in our eco-chaplaincy training too, where we're kind of constantly coming back to the question of how can we be open-hearted and responsive in the face of all of the world's suffering. So it's a big question, and I'm gonna see about time. Again, I have notes of what I want to share, and I didn't do like a really good dry run of it to see how long it would take. And I'd like to have some time for comments and questions too. So we'll see where I end up, but that's where I'd like to end up. And I'll begin though with just providing some context, some background of Brahma Vihara and Brahma Vihara practice. So the Brahma Viharas translate as the abodes of the heart. They're also regarded as excellent, lofty, or boundless states of mind. And according to Peter Harvey, a Buddhist scholar, he finds that although it's the Brahma Viharas have really become central tenets to the Buddhist teachings, that the Brahma Vihara meditation practices didn't originally originate within that tradition, but they became central to it. So the four sublime states of mind that were taught by the Buddha, and then others before him, there's love or loving kindness, which is metta in Pali, translated into metta. And there's compassion, which is karuna, sympathetic joy, which is mudita, and equanimity, which is upekkha. And these attitudes or cultivations are regarded as the ideal way of conduct toward all living beings. And Nyanaponika Thera, who's a Theravadan monk, he actually writes that they're the great removers of tension, the great peacemakers in social conflict, and the great healers of wounds suffered in the struggle of existence. They level social barriers, build harmonious communities, awaken slumbering magnanimity long forgotten, revive joy and hope long abandoned, and promote human brotherhood against the forces of egotism. So it's kind of a high calling, a high standard. And really how I think of it is that within the Buddhist tradition of Vipassana, what we practice here is the Brahma Viharas really represent the beautiful and even perhaps hopeful aspects of our human nature. And they're mindfulness practices that protect the mind from falling into reactivity, but they also work to purify the heart. So metta is this capacity, like how is it that we actually strengthen and enhance our capacity for love, and karuna, our capacity to remain present in the face of suffering and pain. Mudita, the capacity for boundless appreciative joy and gratitude. And upekkha, to really enhance our capacity to be with things as they are. And the Brahma Viharas are incompatible with a hating state of mind, with any kind of negative state of mind. And abodes, Vihara is abode, which really indicates that they're not actually just to be visited. They become the dwelling place of the mind. They become the home of the mind and the heart. And as I've been offering these practices every week for a couple of years now, I've really come to consider the Brahma Vihara practices as both central but also inseparable from this traditional Vipassana practice of coming back to the present moment. And in Vipassana, we may find and learn that when we come back again and again to the present moment, we're developing this other capacity, which is seeing into the truth of things as impermanent, the truth of ourselves as without a kind of stable self, without that stability or solid thing. And that's a developing of wisdom or insight into the way things are. But this practice really requires a heart that is kind, a heart that's open, that's malleable. And I sort of dropped hints of that into the guided meditation earlier, because it's not just about training ourselves to see each moment clearly, but it's also opening to it without greed and without aversion. And this opening, in my experience, is one that really requires the heart. It actually has a flavor of friendliness, of love, of kindness. And we might even find for ourselves that if we investigate what the quality is of a non-discriminating mindfulness that can really be with anything that arises, there might be, you might sense a quality of metta, of loving kindness in that. So Theravadan teacher, Deja Napier, and she describes metta as often arising spontaneously as a condition of mindfulness. And she describes metta as capable of healing into the depths of agitation, anger, ill will, and fear that come with our human life. And it's for me considering these depths of agitation, anger, ill will, fear that it's been so prominent and pervasive in the lives of so many of us this past year. And that's, I think, why I ended up finding myself contemplating the Brahma Viharas with respect to this question of engaging in wise response. And it's not a new question for me, actually. It's that question in some ways is what sparked my practice, my investigation, my orientation into the Vipassana tradition. I mean, I mentioned that I have been, well, I didn't say I didn't call myself an environmentalist, but I would call myself an environmentalist, an activist. And that started very early on for me. And it started when I really began learning about the acts of violence committed against other people and the planet. And for me as a young person, I wasn't very happy. I was angry and confused and despairing. And it was really being introduced to the Vipassana practice and also my practices of deep nature connection that really helped me to regain a sense of balance. And then also in that, kind of really start pondering that koan, or that question of how to integrate the work on the cushion with the work in the world, and how the attention to the inner world is reflected in our engagement in the outer world. Again, John's remarks around inner and outer nature. So I actually remember, it was a while ago, I remember giving a talk on engaged Buddhism a while back. And I remember at that time, I focused more on the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness. And so I was really following in some ways like the wisdom thread. And tonight I'm feeling more motivated to follow the heart thread, which both can be seen as the same or lead to the same place. So I'm not going to really go too much into that paradox right now. But again, just to say that when we attend to what is happening in the present moment, by coming back to the breath, to the body, to noticing thoughts and feelings, the impermanent nature of all of these, it's like we really have to, we learn that it takes courage, this act of being present. It takes a capacity of openness and care and sensitivity to really come back and not resist or refuse what's here right now. Pema Chodron, Tibetan teacher, she writes, when people start to meditate or to work with any kind of spiritual discipline, they often think that somehow they're going to improve, which is a sort of subtle aggression against who they really are. It's a bit like saying, if I had a better job, I'd be a much better person. Or if I could only get a nicer house, I'd be a better person. Or if I could meditate and calm down, I'd be a better person. Meditation practice isn't about trying to throw ourselves away and become something better. It's about befriending who we are already. I love that passage for so many reasons, but there's these two moments in it that I wanted to bring our attention to. And the first is where Pema Chodron speaks to that subtle aggression against ourselves that can show up in meditation practice and in meditators. And again, I was sort of hinting at this in the guided sit earlier, but that even in, the Vipassana practice, it's very simple instructions, just coming back to the present moment, using something to help ground the attention, that there can be this subtle violence or subtle aversion that we're committing every time we pull our attention back to the present moment, especially if it's like a yank or a, real strong force pull. And Pema Chodron also speaks to befriending who we are already. And I love this too, because in this way, it's like meditation is an act of friendship with ourselves. And we sometimes describe the quality of metta as a kind of friendliness. So again, in this regard, it's like, well, perhaps we can consider this whole meditation practice as something that's just saturated with this kind, friendly acceptance of our experience, making it not just a practice of being present, but also this exercising of the heart. So I mentioned the eco-chaplaincy training, and part of the application process is an interview. And one of the questions that we always ask when we interview people who have applied to the program is what their current edge is in terms of being with suffering. And, we all have our edges. We're living in a period of, great social and environmental losses. And where is the spot that we run into aversion? And unless and until we're enlightened, I would say we're kind of likely to always have this edge. We bring it up in the eco chaplaincy program because so much of the work of a chaplain is being with those who are in pain and suffering, have experienced loss of some kind. So to really recognize where we get stuck in sitting with that can be really helpful when we show up in that role. So most of the applicants, they'll give us some particular examples, when I'm with this person or in these particular kinds of situations, but they also talk about what happens for them when they meet that edge. And it's usually for them, they've mentioned two main things. All of us have kind of a different tendency, but one is going numb, so shutting down. And then another one is actually taking on someone else. There's a number of people who talk about taking on someone else's pain to the degree that it just is immobilizing. It's just too much. It's depleting and immobilizing. So just to note that when we're taking on someone else's suffering, we're actually not kind of operating from a place of pure compassion. It's something else. And the near enemy of karuna, of compassion, which is what, when we have an open heart, when that open heart meets suffering, we say that it turns to compassion, turns to karuna. So here we are with our open heart, we meet suffering and we just want to kind of take it on, and then we're depleted, and can maybe consider that even. So I was going to say the near enemy of compassion is pity, seen as pity. So there's a distancing, right? But the example I'm giving is actually more of like a merging. And in a way, I would consider that you can kind of sense for yourself, maybe if you have that tendency, what's happening for you. But there's a resisting of being with the grief because we're trying to transform it. We're trying to take it from them and fix it somehow. So there's actually some aversion there that is preventing us from being fully with that suffering. And then the numbness might, be obvious, but it's there's just not the capacity to tolerate it. And in both of these tendencies, and in all the others that show up around our edge with being with suffering, it's the Brahma Vihara practices that really help us to soften at that spot, with those spots of resistance, like increase our capacity to be open to the sufferings and the joys of the world. And what's really quite extraordinary, beautiful, is that we might notice that when we do open our hearts to the truth of suffering, compassion, that the grief we then feel is actually connective. It's connective and it's healing, more than the pain of trying to fix it out of aversion or numbing ourselves to keep ourselves safe. It's kind of this counterintuitive um, thing that it seems like it will destroy us somehow, but instead it opens us. And this practice of being present, opening our hearts in the face of anything, right now I'm talking about suffering, but in the face of anything, it actually brings us into this profound, wider sense of self that is connected to that freedom that we can experience and allow ourselves to feel the boundless nature of who we really are. There's a quotation from Einstein that I'm sure many of you have heard, but it's always worth repeating. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. They experience themselves, their thoughts and feeling, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of their consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So these heart practices, they enhance our capacity to be with suffering, to be with joy. And in doing so, they realize our interconnectedness. And then they also ask us to keep coming back to accept things exactly as they are. And this is the quality of equanimity, the fourth of the Brahma Viharas, and shows up in a bunch of different lists, Buddhist lists. But equanimity is what allows us to be fully present and to let life live through us without being reactive. And as a heart practice, it's not apathetic, it's not withdrawn. Again, these are uh, near enemies, far enemies of equanimity, but it's a balanced way of being that can really hold all of the intense feelings that accompany our deep care. And I actually consider, so I am getting to where I thought I might get, circling there, that one of the most important expressions of equanimity is wise engagement. And the Buddha said that when we know our actions are in alignment with wisdom and what's wholesome, we experience a deep sense of well-being and can respond appropriately to the situation. So when we see things open-heartedly and clearly being the definition of vipassana, the insight practice, clear seeing, then we can free the mind from obscurations and also work to alleviate suffering in our wider connected world. I like to think about Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to racism because he fully accepted that it's real, that it was happening, is happening, that it's here, but he didn't accept that it should continue. So it's actually from this place of openly accepting what is and being balanced in that way that we can tap into an action and a responsivity that can bring healing and richness and creativity, while reactivity kind of just repeats these same patterns. One of my core Dharma teachers is Joanna Macy, who maybe some of you know as well. She's been a mentor of mine for many years, and she's a Buddhist teacher and scholar, and she's a, what do you call her, an ecological activist pioneer. She created crafted something called the work that reconnects, which are a number of practices for um, being with um, the joys and losses in the world and the kind of more than human world. And she would often say, she writes about it and she talks about it, that there's two ways we can live in this world. And one is with a guarded heart, and the other is with a broken heart. And she writes, allowing ourselves to be claimed by this world, willingly offering ourselves to that which we truly belong to. We find that this wide open, broken heart reveals that from the very beginning, nothing has ever been broken. And then we begin tending to that which is not broken. So I'm going to close with a poem, but I first wanted to bring us back in a way to where I started, which is the Brahma Vihara practice and the ways in which cultivating these Brahma Viharas, these abodes of the heart, of metta, of friendliness, of karuna, of that friendliness when met with suffering turns to compassion, of sympathetic joy, where that friendliness that is encounters the happiness of others turns into this joy, this sympathetic joy in another's happiness, and then equanimity, the open-heartedness that holds it all. That these practices of the heart are so aligned with or inseparable from the practice of mindfulness. And one of my mantras has actually become yes. It's like, can I just, for everything that arises, just say yes? You know, like, yes, and this too. Okay, yes, this too. Sometimes I don't say yes. Sometimes I say, okay, okay. Um, Sometimes a little bit easier. But what is it, you know, to develop this capacity to be fully present to what is, as well as this capacity for loving that, for really opening to that, and how that kind of receptive openness can unleash our creativity and our ingenuity, and all of the ways that we keep ourselves kind of strapped down gets opened up when we embrace what is with an open heart, including our recognition of our inherent interconnection and belonging. So here's the poem. It's The Way It Is by Rosemary Watola Trommer. Over and over we break open. We break and we break and we open. For a while we try to fix the vessel, as if to be broken is bad, as if with glue and tape and a steady hand we might bring things to perfect again, as if they were ever perfect, as if to be broken is not also perfect, as if to be open is not the path toward joy. The vase that's been shattered and cracked will never hold water. Eventually it will leak. And at some point, perhaps we decide that we're done with picking our flowers anyway, no longer need a place to contain them. We watch them grow just as wildflowers do, unfenced, unmanaged, blossoming only when they're ready. And my God, how beautiful they are amidst the mounting pile of shards. So I think we have about 5 minutes if anyone